In the history of prisons, there have been characters so dangerous that their presence behind bars provoke constant unease and fear. These humanitarian institutions, created for the rehabilitation and isolation of criminals, sometimes became veritable battlegrounds where the most ruthless and dangerous inmates tested the limits of the system. The crimes they committed in freedom were only an introduction to their actions behind bars, where their true nature could be fully revealed. Manipulation, violence, and domination were the daily routine witnessed by both fellow inmates and prison staff. Albert DeSalvo is a figure that historians and criminologists often present as one of the most controversial in American legal history. DeSalvo, commonly known as the Boston Strangler, confessed to killing 13 women in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. Despite his detailed confessions, he was not formally convicted for these murders due to the lack of direct evidence linking him to the crimes. His statements, in which contained information not previously revealed to the public, contributed to the general belief in his guilt. However, this case remains the subject of analysis and discussion to this day. Born in 1931, DeSalvo had a tumultuous childhood and youth filled with criminal behavior, including thefts and assaults. He was incarcerated in the early 60s for a series of rapes and other crimes. During his time in prison, DeSalvo underwent numerous psychiatric evaluations to understand his motivations and assess his mental state. However, the results of these studies did not provide conclusive answers about his capacity to commit the series of murders he confessed to. DeSalvo died in prison in 1973 as a result of a murder that remains shrouded in mystery to this day. The circumstances of his death, like many aspects of his life, remain unresolved and provoke numerous speculations. Despite the many controversies surrounding his figure, DeSalvo remains one of the most well-known personalities in American criminology, and his story is frequently mentioned in discussions about justice, criminal profiling, and criminal psychology. Richard Speck is a serial killer whose criminal activity and behavior in prison still generate controversy and interest. Convicted for the brutal murder of 8 nursing students in Chicago in 1966, Speck maintained from the beginning of his incarceration the status of one of the most hated and dangerous prisoners. From the start of his sentence, Speck exhibited aggressive and manipulative behavior in prison, where he ultimately served his sentence. He earned a reputation for being brutal and unpredictable. His conduct in prison was filled with violence towards both fellow inmates and prison staff. Speck was involved in numerous fights and confrontations, often resulting in additional punishments and isolation. One of the most significant incidents that revealed the extent of his problems in prison was a video that surfaced in the 1980s. In it, Speck appeared consuming drugs and engaging in sexual acts, indicating severe failures in the prison security system. Speck also seemed to wear women's clothing and behaved in ways that suggested his adaptation to the prison hierarchy on his own extreme terms. Although the prison was supposed to isolate him and provide a certain degree of rehabilitation, Speck continued his destructive and dangerous behaviors, only deepening his isolation and mental problems. His ability to manipulate other prisoners and his relationships with the staff were a constant source of problems within the prison.
Was that true?
Richard Speck died in prison in 1991 from a heart attack, but his story and behavior in prison remain deeply rooted in American criminal history as a warning about the dangers that can arise from inadequate management and supervision of especially dangerous prisoners. Thomas Silverstein is a criminal whose life and behavior in prison represent one of the most extreme examples of the problems of managing the most dangerous offenders. Silverstein, considered one of the most dangerous prisoners in the history of the American penitentiary system, spent most of his adult life in prison, including almost 3 decades in isolation. Silverstein was initially convicted for 4 murders, including the killing of 2 fellow inmates and a prison guard. His aggressive and violent behavior in prison led to his transfer between different penitentiary institutions and ultimately to his placement in the highest security environment, the ADX Florence Prison, also known as Supermax in Colorado. Silverstein was isolated from other prisoners for most of his time in prison. His prolonged isolation was the subject of numerous debates and discussions about the ethics and effectiveness of isolation as a punitive measure. He was kept in a specially designed cell with a high level of security that minimized contact with staff and other prisoners. Silverstein's behavior in prison was not only a challenge for the prison system, but also highlighted the difficulties in managing and rehabilitating high-risk offenders. Despite his isolation, cases of his verbal and physical aggression were still reported. His case contributed to the discussion about the need for reforms in the penitentiary system, especially in the context of the treatment of prisoners subjected to long-term isolation. Thomas Silverstein died in 2019 at Florence Prison from natural causes. Robert Emmenley is a figure who has become a symbol of the extreme aspects of the British prison system. His notoriety reached fame due to the brutality of the crimes committed both in freedom and behind bars. Malley, often referred to as Hannibal the Prisoner, was sentenced to life imprisonment following a series of murders, including the killing of 3 people while serving his sentence. After committing these murders in prison, Malley was moved to a specially designed cell at Wakefield Prison. His cell, often referred to as the glass box, is located underground and was designed to minimize the risk of future attacks. Malley spends 23 hours a day in it, making him one of the most isolated prisoners in UK history. His prolonged isolation has sparked numerous controversies and debates about the psychological and physical treatment of prisoners, considered particularly dangerous. Critics of this treatment argue that prolonged isolation can lead to mental health deterioration, which is evident in Memley's case, as he has repeatedly appealed to be transferred to a psychiatric hospital for better treatment of his mental disorders. Despite these appeals, Memley remains in extreme isolation, raising questions about the humanitarian aspects of the prison system. His case is frequently cited in discussions about prison system reform and better attention to the mental health needs of prisoners, especially those with high-risk profiles. Robert Memley is a figure that forces reflection on the limits and effectiveness of punitive isolation methods, while also showing how the prison system manages the most difficult cases. James Whitey Bulger is one of the most significant and controversial figures in the history of organized crime in the United States in the prison system. Bulger, who led the Winter Hill Gang in Boston for years, was not only a serial killer and mob boss, but also an FBI informant, complicating his story both before his arrest and during his time in prison. After years on the run, Bulger was arrested in 2011 and convicted of a series of crimes, including involvement in numerous murders. His time in prison was filled with controversies and challenges for the prison administration. Despite his age, Bulger continued to instill fear and was considered a very influential figure. Bulger's behavior in prison attracted interest from both the media and prison staff. His reputation as a criminal who had collaborated with federal agents meant that other inmates and some of the staff treated him with great distrust. In 2018, Bulger was transferred to the prison in Hasselt, West Virginia, where his life ended brutally. He was murdered by other inmates, underscoring the dangers associated with his figure both outside and inside prison. Bulger's murder in prison raised many questions about how the prison system manages very high-profile and highly dangerous prisoners. Bulger's case highlighted how challenging it can be to ensure the safety of inmates who have both enemies and a controversial past. Ted Kaczynski is a figure who entered history as the Unabomber, responsible for a series of bomb attacks that lasted almost 20 years from the late 70s to the mid-90s. Kaczynski, a former mathematician and university professor, used his professional and intellectual skills as tools of terror by building complex bombs that he sent to universities and airlines, resulting in the deaths of 3 people and injuring 23 more. After his arrest in 1996 and his sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Kaczynski was incarcerated in a federal maximum security prison. His life behind bars became a case study for both forensic psychology experts and prison staff. In prison, Kaczynski exhibited behaviors that could be described as withdrawn and extremely introverted. His contact with other prisoners was minimal, reflecting his life before his arrest when he lived in isolation in his cabin in Montana. Kaczynski spent most of his time reading and writing, developing his theories about society and technology, which often led to conflicts with prison administration due to the content of some of his writings. Despite the lack of direct physical violence, Kaczynski's behavior in prison was a challenge for the prison administration. His strong convictions and tendency to express his opinions through complaints and protests were a constant source of tension. Prison authorities also had to implement special security measures to ensure that Kaczynski could not continue his criminal activity or rally potential followers from the outside. Charles Manson is one of the most disturbing and recognizable figures in the history of the American criminal system. Manson, primarily known as the leader of the Manson family cult, which committed a series of brutal murders in the late 60s, displayed similar manipulative and destructive tendencies during his time in prison. After his arrest in 1969 and his sentencing to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment, Manson spent the rest of his life behind bars. In prison, Manson quickly became a central figure, continuing his manipulations and exerting influence over other prisoners. His ability to influence people did not diminish. On the contrary, he seemed to find new ways to maintain psychological control over his followers and to gain new adherents in prison. Manson was often involved in conflicts with other prisoners and prison staff. His presence in prison was a constant source of tension, and the incidents he was involved in were frequently related to attempts at manipulation, intimidation, or even planning more acts of violence. Moreover, his fame and distinctive personality made him a subject of interest for the media, further complicating his management in the prison environment. Manson was sanctioned numerous times for various prison infractions, including possession of a mobile phone, which suggests attempts to communicate with the outside world in violation of prison regulations. His behavior in prison reflected his pre-arrest character, unpredictable, dangerous, and deeply rooted in a destructive personality. Until the end of his life, Charles Manson remained a complex and controversial figure, and his presence in prison was an ongoing challenge for the prison system. Thanks for staying until the end of the video. See you in the next edition. Give us a like if you enjoyed it, and always remember to subscribe to The Daily Astonishing.